This first journal serves as our survival notes. Finished on May 26, 2026 at 2:36 a.m. We officially finished editing this entire video on June 6, 2026 at 11:54 p.m. Somehow it happened on Pushkin's birthday. Some sections were written during periods of emotional intensity, confusion, exhaustion, or instability. Perspectives expressed in the journal reflect personal experiences and evolving interpretations at the time of writing, and should not be understood as definitive judgments about institutions or individuals. This work is ultimately not intended as an attack or declaration of certainty, but as a raw document of artistic survival, memory preservation, and personal transformation. Goodbye, as we say hello. Prelude, Magicless Magic Flute. I've waited for so long to publish at least this prelude. For a large autobiography. For those who know my aestheticism. Before making an artwork, music, or a tech project, I've always planned a thorough prelude. The prelude is not about who is your audiences, how to attract people for more of your propaganda. What's the correct terminologies you should use? Think it as sketches of those psychopaths. You draw what you gonna do next. And those little memories helped you organize your thoughts better. Yeah, in most job development personality tests, I was told I am either a strong introvert or 100% introverted, and my life has been surrounded by other inspiring functional introverts too. However, I prefer UK parapsychology community's interpretation better, where in O-Life test, I scored 4 out of 5 on Machiavellianism, a certified psychopath. Speaking of imposter syndrome, if you are truly an involuntary imposter that living in other people's reality, you will understand that the only way of overcoming it is to overthrow this imposter Ponzi scheme, to overwrite a performative reality that forced you to perform, and to ultimately create your own whimsical theater where you can be a proud actor of your total reality. By the time I am compiling this prelude, I am making a firm decision to take my life in a new direction. For those who wonder, what's your culture, what's your indigenousness? My answer is this: I read my tarot cards, cast the I Ching, and read my own palm. And they told me that after more than 12 years of struggle in college, there would be a catastrophe, a turning point, where my career would move in many directions in parallel. This entire book is written at different times, collecting notes from different stages of my life. Though my attitude changes over time, I tend to preserve, word for word, the original notes and reflect on what has changed. This Christmas, December 25th, 2025, I am making a huge decision to turn my life in a more whimsical direction. I will continue my Kusudharma research by reaching out to occult and parapsychology communities, integrating my existing Black shamanic rites and Anglican faith. Then I will open the North Pacific Step Forum to reshape our geopolitical worldview. Finally, I will refine my indie art, music, and tech approach, and sum it up into 3 lifelong styles: unfounded resemblance, avant nemenlos, and whimsical netmasek. On January 20th, 2026, after a series of events, upon confirmation that I can graduate with a double degree after 12 years of residency, unless the college regrets issuing me a certificate, which is unlikely, I am going to say what I have hesitated to say all in this one autobiography. My research, my remaining memory notes, survived my declining memory due to shelter psychiatric abuses, sleeping disorders caused by irresponsible housing management, and many more circumstances. As I am writing this first paragraph, editing, erasing, rewriting, I keep thinking about Professor Gerald's MUS 103 class, which I took twice, and how the first paragraph is always the hardest part. Recently, I got into so many problems, and now it is January 21st, 1:41 a.m. As I am editing this first prelude, I decided to minimize writing about conflicts and instead focus on the process of my art. I will not write lengthy details about the summer cohort either after this prelude, though it was one of the reasons I am writing this. One of the most beautiful philosophies I have learned so far was something Professor Gerald once said, that sometimes everyone is right, though no one communicates well, and communication is always incomplete. On January 19th, 2026, I was about to convert a music file Professor Paulina recorded to share with Professor Gerald, and I also hope one day to be able to play that piece with an EWI flute. Then I attended online parapsychology meetings where Julia Mossbridge spoke about childhood experiences with the CIA, unconditional love, AI, and how to share unusual experiences. To be honest, that meeting saved my karma that day. because that night I got into an argument with my superintendent. For 3 months, there had been a major heater leak, and for years our building had suffered from all kinds of problems. I tried to be the nicest person in the building. More than 3 neighbors told me the superintendent was lazy and advised me to speak up, while others repeatedly called him demanding action. I was sympathetic, so I left text messages, sent videos, and gave him space. 3 months later, he accused me of not calling him, saying, "Don't just text me videos, I gotta see what happened to the heater." He had an attitude, saying he was not like our housing manager, that he was not there to blame me, and he kept finding excuses. That was when confrontation began, and we finally got things done. I also brought up an old issue, years ago, when our building had heater problems. My sink also leaked. According to the housing manager, the superintendent said I hadn't reported it for 3 months because I couldn't afford to fix it. The superintendent later denied saying this and claimed the manager made it up. I had recorded all the evidences. I could have filed a lawsuit, but I didn't. Whether it was him or the manager who was lying, the person with the least power is always the one blamed. It's not that I screenshot everything, but that I must protect myself. Every other year there are gas or water issues, long delays, and then blame is assigned to whoever is easiest to target. That is why I document everything. However, when I realized I had all the evidence proving I was right, including videotape I could use against him, I suddenly thought of another incident where I had involuntarily recorded a music professor I deeply admired and still do. My heart softened. This time, I chose to keep those records to myself. I gave the superintendent my last $100 in cash, wished him a happy new year, and we talked it out. The more I thought about that professor, the more I regretted having done something like that. Though I do not regret the confrontation itself. Over the next 2 days, I edited this prelude again, removing about 70% of the original material, including a memo about the summer cohort. If the leaking heater, broken windows, an $11,000 water bill opportunistically pinned on me, cold sleepless nights, and the loss of all my upper teeth remind me of anything, it is that during those times I restored my art projects. Then I accidentally entered the music composition major. My CS major best friend listened to me vent every week. Piano 3 and 4, ear training, and 2 music history classes with Professor Lewis became the foundation of many later works. Looking back, maybe everything was simply fate. The most common question employers or graduate programs ask is, "Tell us about your research, and how did you get there?" After staying in college for so long, about 12 years, I finally realized I need a secondary project that represents about 10% of what I really do. People assume I speak without filters, but in truth, I express only about 30% of what I want to do. The other 70% is not something most people can experience in a lifetime. Aside from my therapist and my private database, only a small group of people tolerated that remaining 20 to 30% and helped me turn those ideas into living musical art, capable of hosting the unexplainable in my indie universe. Professor Gerald came closest to reaching that threshold. That is how I understand art, music, and worldview. Not as universal tolerance, but as a gate to what cannot be openly seen or explained. I express the remaining 70% through clandestine means, embedded in indie communities, parapsychology circles, and non-conventional groups unknown to most people. Some of it is disturbing, some esoteric, some secretive. If I were to give a soft truth about the origin of Kusudama, here is an encrypted one. In the summer of 2025, a year away from an unexpected event, I thought I had gotten into a cohort that could help me refine my research idea, which represented about 1% of the 30% that Professor Gerald had helped me formulate a semester earlier. I wanted to research matriarchal influences in music and art as the iceberg tip for curating my Kusudama universe. A worldview without a cultural center, without a spiritual center, and without a moral center. The Kusudama idea itself is not tied to any single culture, and I only came up with the idea on January 13, 2025. I was not even aware of its special communities in the US or elsewhere prior to that day. Though I had heard of Kusudama before, I folded my first Kusudama only during the summer of 2025. It was a long story. Anyway, the summer cohort did not go well, and I will skip the details for later. I noticed that people from collective communities tend to speak in similar vocabularies and tones. I am not accusing individuals, just speaking in general. Still, I found it amusing that at the beginning of this semester I watched The Last Emperor. Then, when the semester began, I watched the Russian film Styliagi for Professor Barsky's Russian literature class assignment, and somehow another similar musical film, The Red Violin, caught my attention. One melody in The Last Emperor, Goodbye Mr. Johnston, particularly struck me. For the first time, I learned that this melody is called Auld Lang Syne. That melody, in turn, influenced many of my later inventions. That was when I decided to write my major summer reflection, which remains an ongoing project. As for the ongoing Kusudama research, it is simply a new name for a very old project of mine, mapping global Armageddon effects, for which I had already collected a large amount of data. The academic version of this work dates back to May 30th, 2024, when I was experiencing a deep depression. For reasons I can only describe as divine coincidence, I accidentally won a summer scholarship, and then accidentally swapped my fall classes to attend a summer course, Professor Thurm's theoretical computing class. I admired the fact that he had undergone heart surgery and was still teaching at age 76, and that he was extremely supportive. He was funny, once mentioning how he bought a $1 shirt with missing buttons, which reminded me of the opposite of theater bureaucracy, and the performative fundraising events I witnessed in a homeless shelter. At those events, the same grifters would fake their cries to beg wealthy donors for money, invite Broadway singers, and then tell other homeless people, "You are earning your bed." At the end of the semester, I accidentally asked Professor Thurm for a chance game and a favorite color for my ongoing 7-colored flower music project, where many unrelated themes were woven together. As part of that process, I used it as a form of divination and received I Ching hexagram 39. It was a long and complicated story that is hard to explain, but many things have slowly fallen into place since then. Afterward, I unexpectedly entered the CTP data science cohort, which I had failed to enter for 3 years after repeated TTP and CTP applications. Coincidentally, one of the entry questions asked, "What's the last song you listened to?" At the time, I had been listening to a piece by Professor Gerald during the orientation break. When I took a screenshot to look back later, the timer happened to stop at 39 again. During that semester, I did not get along well with my mother in our online communications. She was paranoid and repeatedly told me that if Trump sent me to Venezuela, I should call her. She also described a dream in which an Asian woman and a skinny Western man with curly hair tried to assassinate her. But the Asian woman hesitated, and my mother woke up. Strangely, I told her that I had frequently seen 2 people near Brooklyn College who looked exactly like that pair. We would occasionally see each other and smile. I drew them during a Skype screen sharing session, and my mother said they looked identical to the figures from her dream. After that conversation, I never saw those 2 people again. It was another paranoid exchange, paired with anxious dreams, email hacking scares, and social security compromise alerts. That event triggered my own paranoia. Later, I had a dream about a worm trying to sneak into a cake mix. Somehow, I turned that dream into an unfinished children's fairy tale play. I also created an electronic music album titled You Are No Less Dope When You Mention I Won, which is not difficult to decode if you are familiar with clandestine documents. It is a meditation album, and I plan to illustrate and publish the play in the future. The album's purpose is to mock certain rascal my sidekicks, if you know what I mean. Let the cheese squeak. It would be funny if 2 rascal mice saw each other in the same mirror and panicked. Those 2 semesters were not peaceful, but in retrospect, many things seem inevitable. After several arguments with my mother over Skype, we began discussing superstition. She started to reconcile and recalled how shamans and fortune tellers once told her that I was the reincarnation of powerful spirits, that my life would be uneven, but that I would regain life later. I also frequently had strange dreams in which spirits attempted to communicate with me and instructed me to search indirectly, through things such as my natural OSINT abilities before learning Western methods, my accidental collection of nearly all major literature by Adam Weishaupt, and numerous rare reports related to Agvan Dorsheave, whom I long believed I might be connected to or reincarnated from. Some of these dreams were horrifying, involving disasters and separations, while others carried themes of large-scale global change. One spirit my mother recalled from the shaman's descriptions was that I resembled the Armageddon Buddha Metria statue near a temple that later became a French Catholic church, now located in the North Pacific Steppe. I told her I was not interested in laughing Buddhas with big bellies, but I did have a spiritual and geopolitical connection with North Pacific Steppe communities, where I claim to be the reincarnation of Agvan Dorsheave, or Elayarping, depending on terminology. I do not care much about labels. I had been guided by similar impulses, whether spiritual, psychological, or fated. I also frequently dreamed of two kinds of scarecrows. One group joined me, the other lacked hearts and eventually scattered. This vision later helped me formulate my own ounce universe, which I associate loosely with Professor Lewis and Professor Gerald, our Glinda and Southern Good Witch. After the summer incident, when someone referenced Glinda and her bubble as a subtle form of gaslighting, I realized that our ounce universe no longer needed Glinda. Those positive influences could remain as memories, manifesting instead as the 7-colored flower and clustered algorithms from the north and south. Later, another dream inspired mint green flask, a vision of a large flask containing an island called Deliney Reed, where I embedded secret symbols, memories, and expressions. I believe that is what the dream was pointing toward. Around this time, I developed the idea of life appropriation, a concept meant to transcend and bypass the misuse of culture appropriation rhetoric, and the you don't know the culture accusations that many people experience. It is a protest against terminology gatekeepers and social comparative pseudoscience grifters, who parrot language to gaslight syncretic minorities and their supporters, in contrast to sincere social scientists who aim to build bridges. Wicked or not, our Plan B and life appropriation projects will continue. If the dream holds meaning, then the scarecrows without hearts will collapse on their own, and those with hearts will eventually collaborate with our universe.
It was also during this period that we recalled Professor Gerald while speaking with our mother, reminding her that a year earlier we had nearly stopped talking after a serious argument. We later experienced a series of nightmares, then learned about the Blue Daniel piece, and gradually things shifted. We showed our mother our latest research on musical forms, particularly the Azande documentaries I had collected. She immediately became impatient and questioned why we studied such useless material. This reaction reminded us of a music critic professor we actually admire. She disliked Liszt, and our defense of Liszt, along with our criticism of Sibelius, whose music we do enjoy, somehow triggered her. That is where things began. She showed us Yevgeny Kissin performing La Campanella and criticized him for being showy. When we criticized Casta Diva, she responded, "Back then, we didn't have woke." We could partially agree with her. It was a mixture of misunderstanding and fair debate. We turned her critique of Kissin into a form of pedagogy, mixing it with Zach's unique style of love roasting from our data science training. We told our mother, "Do you want to know what's more of a waste of time?" Then we played a piece by Cornelius Cardew and criticized certain performative music trends, which we labeled Avant Trends Guard. We mentioned Cardew only to defend Stockhausen. Stockhausen once had high hopes for Cardew and praised his talent. When Cardew failed to become the avant-garde figure expected of him, he shifted positions, became a communist, and began accusing Stockhausen of serving imperialism. Cardew's writing is filled with hostility toward individualism and biased reasoning, using the tools he learned from Stockhausen to discredit him while promoting his own, inclusive, music ideology. We struggle to accept such figures. Even average communists, and perhaps even Confucius, would likely reject this performative inclusion that sacrifices individual voices like Stockhausen's, who lived amid conflict while fostering global syncretic expression. We later reformulated our appreciation of the new music movement, separating it from performative, we don't like, music. We committed to restudying extended techniques and exploring emotional depth during our final semester. Our goal is not to belong to a so-called new movement, but to understand a specific kind of avant-garde we genuinely admire. Even understanding one style would be sufficient. As Stockhausen said, what is truly new is a method that creates a new experience for the audience. Our return to this territory is driven by a single style that shocked us in a way I had never experienced before. For Stockhausen and Ruski, the influence was conceptual. For the style we call Avant the Menlos, the experience is far more complex, and we are still exploring it. After forcing our mother to listen to our rules, we shared with her my findings on G.U.Taka, a Sunday syncretic music that blends church melodies with familiar local rhythms tied to spirituality, and many other examples. These reconciliation conversations eventually led us to watch a YouTube series called The Legend of Bude, known in Japan as Hote. The series was permanently removed by the end of the semester, likely due to copyright claims. I shared it with Celine, my career coach, after realizing that television shows can sometimes ease family tensions. When the show disappeared, my mother and I found another series in Khmer with English subtitles for the final episodes. We learned a new word together, the Khmer term for master, maybe grupo. The show depicted one incarnation of Metria, Bude or Hote. What initially drew me in was the music, which resembled Chakacha rhythms I had learned about in Professor Gerald's Music 103 class. The best music introduction class in the world, one I wish I could remain in forever. In winter 2024, I learned about a summer cohort. The person who responded to my email was exceptionally kind and became one of my favorite people from that program, which ultimately led me to join. Although the collaboration lasted only 3 weeks, I remain deeply grateful. I believe it was a necessary journey. I do not regret setting boundaries, and I have already prepared space to write 2 apology drafts. On the final night of 2025, just before the new year, I drank red wine and reflected on the past. One of the most meaningful gifts I received was a New Year's greeting from Professor Gerald. That night, I composed several wild and intuitive musical pieces. I had just completed my graduate applications, supported by recommendation letters from Professor Paulina, my therapist Mozena, my Reverend Nigel, and my Russian literature professor, Professor Pavel. They wrote letters for Harvard, Columbia, Princeton, and CUNY. It was the summer cohort that encouraged me to aim that high. During the first interview, I bluntly stated that all PhDs were fake to me and that I had joined the cohort primarily to speak with Professor Gerald. I even said that if I stayed at CUNY, I would ask her to serve on my dissertation committee. After that rocky beginning, the cohort challenged me to look beyond CUNY. The second interview also went poorly. On impulse, I said I would apply to Harvard, Columbia, and Princeton as well. I am still applying, even after being gently edged out. Regardless of outcomes or the condition of my portfolio, these applications are my personal trophies. I do feel some guilt toward the office lady who first responded to my email. She was very kind. I regret that I am not part of the socialist movement, and do not share many ideologies reflected in the summer readings. Though I did read them carefully, I still appreciated much of the fellow's work. Even my failed communication with the director contained insight. I believe he was acting protectively toward an ethnomusicology student instructor, which ultimately isolated me. Returning to the research idea, in winter 2024 I presented a proposal to Professor Paulina. I wanted to study Hutchinson's theory, an open source text Professor Gerald had shared, partly as a way to reconnect with her. This was 1 semester before I took Music 103. I then developed the idea of studying syncretic communities such as Schnitt, focusing on emotion, personal history, and spirituality rather than theory alone. That was the beginning. On January 13, 2025, an extraordinary event introduced me to a spiritual community connected to Kusudama, details I will never share publicly. That experience later merged with my indie development lore, the Little Red Riding Hood. The following semester, in Professor Barsky's Russian class, the phrase, rosy cheeks, used to describe certain Russian characters sparked my interest in rose-like Kusudama forms. I later discovered Maria Simonskaya's Rose Kusudama, which became the second piece I folded after Daniel Wojcicki's Trinity Kusudama. When the computer science department began scrutinizing students who took a course multiple times, I exploited a system gap to enroll in Professor Gerald's Music 103 class. That was when I fully shared the Kusudama idea with her, and refined it into a worldview without cultural, spiritual, or moral centers. After a semester of mentorship, I condensed the work into a matriarchal perspective, where female influences in music and art could enter mainstream discourse. Though I had conflicts with many people, most eventually resolved, thanks to those who supported me. The Kusudama worldview continued to grow quietly within my indie universe. Later, I interviewed for the summer pipeline. The interview felt like a failure only because everyone was kind, including the person I later clashed with. I had nothing against the ethnomusicology student instructor personally, but her logic, combined with the director's protectiveness, made neutral interpretation impossible. The experience was jarring. As I admitted, I struggle socially and get along with only a few people. I expressed interest in studying psychology alongside music, to identify patterns such as gaslighting, double binds, and stonewalling, so I could cope or strategically align with supportive individuals. I value confrontation, but not above appreciation. I also described another incident where a professor dismissed both me and my teammate after I raised a concern. I do not resent her. In fact, I am grateful she offered me a backup plan during my data science cohort. I simply cannot understand dismissing my teammate as well, while telling him it was not his fault. He dropped the course and lost a semester. Most importantly, beyond parapsychology, I want to study psychology to ensure meaningful collaboration if I ever work with Professor Gerald again. The psychology student in the cohort was kind and insightful, and I admired his questions from day one. In contrast, the ethnomusicology student instructor was extremely dismissive, after telling her I barely had any recommenders and that I had many troubles, and that Professor Cohen had helped me a lot, and that at the time Professor Paulina had a 1-month-old baby. I thankfully bugged Professor Gerald to help me. I later went emotional, telling the interviewers that all PhDs are fake to me. The only reason I want to go for this cohort is so that I can ask Professor Gerald for advice. And I originally wanted to do research on Hutchinson's theory she recommended. That ethnomusicologist student instructor just wouldn't allow you to say no. She tried to recommend that a lot of what you said sounds like ethnomusicology, in a similar way that the director later attempted to lobby me to change my career to music education repeatedly when I was in the program, mentioning how music composition faculties are mostly white supremacists and don't care about what you express, and that I should focus on pedagogies. I understand their good intentions, but I learn by composing, so I rejected the idea but thanked them for their recommendations. Also, that ethnomusicologist student instructor mentioned during the interview that I should just ask Professor Paulina for letters, saying, it doesn't matter, she had worked with Professor Paulina and knew her. I understand Professor Paulina doesn't mind, and my skin is very thick when presenting my ideas, but sometimes it's not thick enough for me to knock on doors by email when she has a 1-month-old baby.
Everyone else got it and tried to change the topic. I extremely thank that psychology major student for switching the topic and asking me why I wanted to study psychology, and that office lady who first responded to my email also suggested we move to the next topic. Of course, in psychology, this is a very common double-binding statement. You're not supposed to say no in such situations. The person may seem to suggest something, but in reality may not want to be challenged. I only survived 3 weeks in this summer cohort, but this 3 weeks wasn't all wasteful. I still got inspired by so many wonderful people. The first day, I was late due to the irregularity of the building which faced the other side, along with several other students who were also late. That manager was so kind, and she smiled at me telling me it is okay, and I actually made a commitment to never be late again. That was also the first day I had any interactions with that ethnomusicologist instructor, which I presented the paper regarding matriarchal influences in music to her, where Professor Gerald helped me put up half of the stuffs. The first reaction is that those sound like buzzwords, and matriarchal may not be a correct term. You need to think about a time period and find archival stuffs. I actually sincerely cooperated with her and changed everything as instructed, which I renamed my paper as Female Influences in Music, reframed many of the vocabularies. I was also never late since then. The first day we had a few games and exercises which were quite fun. One interesting quiz test your skill of following the instructions, which you supposed to read all the lines before doing anything. I had zero suspicion thinking about this cohort had the nicest person, and I just not think far about unwritten rules and tricks and all that. So I ended up doing silly stuff such as read, stand up, and walk around, which you supposed to not doing those until you read all the lines. Fortunately, I have another cohort fellow, a first-generation Nigerian-American student majoring in anthropology, which is one of the 2 fellows I found most inspiring through reading their works, happened to also follow my path of having zero suspicion of unwritten rules. Surprisingly, this guy had a few things in common with me in terms of academia struggles, and I won't try to say I would experience half of the hardship he had been through. but his presence and experiences had always made me feel welcomed, despite we may not share the similar political stances. The first week was not so bad. Did I just mention that psychology student instructor? I messed up during the first week, and I am still not sure if I ever did something wrong. But that psychology instructor was always very kind. He introduced himself as an African student with a Japanese-sounding name, and he liked sushi, and he smiled, said people thought I were Japanese until they saw me. I smiled back, didn't mean anything offensive, which later somehow triggered that ethnomusicology student instructor. The first week when we were talking about graduate school and unwritten rules, we were advised to find 3 doctors who can write us recommendation letters. So, I asked that psychology student instructor if I can find some doctors from Fivers. The reason is that I had a huge conflict with a professor, and my old plan is to take a break from any music classes to give everyone a break. That anthropologist student was being supportive, which he followed up saying he had very similar experiences. Then somehow he was cut short by that ethnomusicology student instructor, and I don't know what actually triggered her. She was very angry, and basically reframed the entire event into something else, then saying, "You know, when someone talk and you smile is very disrespectful. You should apologize to them after class. And words have consequences, the wall has ears. They can cut your fun for any reasons when they think you are not ready. They don't care if you or your family get cancer. They don't care if you have a mental breakdown." She then kept venting about graduate school stuffs, then somehow changed topic to the lateness issue, with similar tones such as in graduate school they don't tolerate you kind of rhetoric. Then she point out the other manager student instructor, saying, "Do you know what she was been through? She came from New Jersey." She kept venting for the remaining of the afternoon. And to be honest, I felt a bit sorry for her, but those types of speech just overwhelmed me that week. Our first assignment is to write a reflection on our journey. I wrote about my purpose and past challenges. I also indicated that in the past people have been referencing my disability and mental illnesses in quite interesting ways whenever there is a conflict, and it's better to talk it out instead of waiting for the last minute full confrontation. When I am offering many chances of reconciliations, I also made up my mind to never be late, and I read other people's reflections as well. There was a girl from Brooklyn College majoring in Africana study also wrote in her own reflection about lateness issue, and challenges which I found quite inspiring. She was also my debate and small group partner a few times. I did well in summarizing at the beginning. Then we had extra time. I started to mention Professor Gerald, and somehow convinced her that she wanted to write down and look it up over the internet. I enjoyed talking to this person and be aware of the positionally issues when I am writing about matriarchal influences in music. Then another Brooklyn College hidden treasure goes to a political science student, which is one of my 2 favorites in terms of research paper. She did research on political space and sense-making on African migrants. I enjoy reading her papers, reflections, and learning all the new terminologies, and found so many things to be very insightful. She is the quietest person in the entire cohort. Quieter than me, which I am not quiet when in my private space though. But her paper and thoughts are also powerful. Also, that office lady is my upper favorite too. The office lady was the first person who responded to my email, and she was one of the kindest person you can find. Even that musicology student instructor I didn't get along with saw her as a sister figure, and speak highly about her. She was very kind to me. When I mentioned that I don't have enough professors to write me a recommendation letters, when I first applied to this cohort, and during 2 interviews she was being extremely kind as well. IV always appreciated that the director offered her an office position, and my last conversation with that director is that I wish the cohort can somehow convince her to pursue a PhD, which she has every talent to get one. The other manager was quiet but very kind as well, and she sometimes graded other people's homework until late at night. Since that ethnomusicologist student knew Professor Paulina, I always made an internal favorable decision toward her, including writing 2 short apology drafts to smooth things out, and even promising the manager that I would just roll with everything during the face-to-face meetings. Then somehow the director decided to see me early, though I knew he was simply being nice and overprotective toward that ethnomusicologist student, whom he thought I was being dismissive toward after a chain of incidents. These included her nearly yelling at the class, telling people, "The wall has ears. They don't care if you or your family get cancer. They don't care if you have a mental breakdown," or scolding people for not reading her material enough, and saying how some people feel like they're Glinda, they have a bubble and don't care about anything. The most disturbing part was when only 2 people, including me, had used the term empirical in our research. We were still in the psychology student instructor's gentle workshop, when the ethnomusicologist instructor interrupted out of nowhere, first roasting the term autoethnography, saying how those are just big fancy terms. Then she said how the term empiricals was used in phrenology against minorities, and she described it in detail. Then she told the class that nowadays whiteness not only applies to European colonialism, but also to those who assimilate into it. That's how the conflict started. Then it was denied, and I was disciplined. I will just write everything here after removing 90% of the details so that I don't need to write them again in future chapters. That musicologist was giving a very unpleasant lecture, where even the most talkative student at the time was silent and looking in one direction at her desk. That's the reason I made a very sharp response, where I asked the other girl why she used the term empirical, since we were the only 2 people who used that term. Then I gave a radical example about a Nigerian immigrant in Siberia teaching Mandarin, and how pseudoscience can be overwritten with new evidence. I further defended myself that I used the term empirical based on this principle of observations and experiments that can be changed and modified. That musicologist student instructor then went full vent in triangulation mode, where although she sounded like she was talking to everyone, those comments sounded unpleasant and personally targeted. She said that in PhD programs there are rules, but if someone doesn't follow rules then they can challenge them. And she went on and on in a satirical way, then telling people other people have their own projects and they are not your minimi. She went on venting and then told the class, you were barking up the wrong tree, and then told the class not to let people shame you for your methods. This happened right after I swapped her out to choose that psychologist student as my advisor, and at exactly the same time during break she made a sharp confrontational comment on my summer reflection, saying that at graduate school level you have to deal with such and such, then telling me it is not what you say but how you say it. At exactly the same weekend, that director sent the entire class an email, saying he was piggybacking on that musicologist student instructor about the "it is not what you say but how you say it" thing, and then quoted a whole book. That's where the conflict started. I originally wanted to resolve it privately with just 5 relevant people, but then I was accused of being dismissive against a female minority instructor. That director denied that claim that the instructor said, "You are barking up the wrong tree," and he even made up a vocabulary word that started with B, and told me a few times that it could be English problems. I asked him if he could still remember what he said about that B word. He couldn't remember. Then I emailed the CUNY musicology director Eliot Bates, asking if I had such and such conditions, should I apply for the program? Given all the information about what that musicology instructor said about Glinda, The Wall Has Ears, and how she suffered, which gave people an impression that she suffered a lot in this CUNY program. I also subtly hoped that if there was someone in the program making that musicologist student instructor behave this way, then the department might want to check something. To my huge surprise, I learned a few pieces of information, but I will not talk openly about them here. That summer cohort director later said that the musicologist student had first-hand experiences about what she said, but not in CUNY though. Then he insisted I should apologize to her, saying how they could read each other's minds, and how she lived in deep Queens, and all that. I do see that the musicologist student indeed validated this director, where he felt like he is privileged and not doing enough. That's the duet where that musicologist student kept comparing what white supremacists could have during Thanksgiving and other stuff, then dragged other minorities' sufferings into her comparative speech. Then the director added a bit of comment. She was occasionally angry and giving people an impression that graduate school is not for the weak, and basically she roasted a fellow for using AI, others for not reading enough about her stuff. I read everything and made thoughtful comments. Then she responded with Glinda and her bubble. She also made similar comments saying don't let us abandon you. We really don't want to, especially we are all minorities. Those comments made me extremely uncomfortable, and I don't know if other people are just used to this or if those are really educational, as the director had told me. I tried my best to reconcile, even if by the end of the 3 weeks I told the director a clear no in regard to apologizing, especially since I had already previously attempted to. But I just stepped down anyway before 2025 ended. After that, another student told me, "Dude, I was thinking about something totally different," with a crying emoji. "I know you don't get along with that instructor, but please don't use me as an example." After checking in with her, I actually promised the director and manager to downplay this incident and to just roll with everything and apologize. Then I also emailed Columbia and Harvard asking about recommendation letter related stuff. I especially wanted to talk to Professor George E. Lewis regarding his thoughts on a few things. To my huge surprise, he listed a few resources and told me he would be having an extended leave since 2026. I then somehow read Professor Eliot Bates' free book sample on Amazon Kindle regarding Turkish electronic music, which I was interested in for his perspective. To my surprise, he mentioned an electronic work that Professor George E. Lewis was talking about, and listed reasonable criticism and other people's quotes. To be honest, those moments created a big inspiration on my musical journey. I kind of agree and disagree with both of them, especially since I had been silently designing something in secret with limited resources. In regard to machine improvisation and understanding of history and experiences, this is a taboo. At a certain point I agree with what Professor Eliot wrote in his book, that a machine cannot really take a side, and we don't really have a unified understanding of history and experiences. On the other hand, I seriously admire what Professor George E. Lewis did, and I strongly believe that a machine can indeed inherit memory, experiences, or even emotion, which is a taboo. But those factors are all individualized, and there can never be a universal or unified memory that belongs to a group of people, rather than a personal image of one living algorithm, which is what I am secretly implementing in these years. A collective large language model, or any machine, can only reflect one perspective or a union of many perspectives that have been pre-ordered. It will never be able to reach true autonomy. However, I still believe that individualized machine autonomy is achievable, where all the derivatives can live under that one polycentric universe, similar to Stockhausen's Momenti or Liszt's program music. As for now, I don't hold any grudges against that summer cohort musicologist instructor or anyone anymore. In fact, I feel a bit sorry for the director for telling me all those stories about himself and others. Although I didn't take much of his advice, I still thought of him as a kind person who was a bit overprotective toward that musicologist student instructor. So I took a step back and apologized to them before the new year of 2026, without compromising my own memory as well. If there is anything nice I can remember about this cohort, I enjoyed listening enough to that psychology student talking about EQ, which I have nearly zero of. I read everyone's research, and two people in particular stayed in my mind. One was a political science student who did research on the political space of migrants. She also drew a sketch of that office lady who was extremely kind. The other was an anthropology student who was very knowledgeable, and I enjoyed reading his essay about knowledge work and its worth. There was also a very talented instructor, and he was trying to say that all humans only have 0.0000% differences. He tried to say it in a very funny way, which almost made me laugh, but I was afraid people would get offended. After class, I went to the bathroom mirror thinking, you know what? If you swap the ones and zeros, that's how big a difference you made. Guess what? 1 week later, that guy became a doctor. I will skip some stuff here, and I don't think this summer cohort was 100% conflict. It was, in fact, quite fine, even though I didn't survive 3 weeks. Another thing that caught my mind is that a political science student drew a pencil sketch of that office lady and gave it to her. She was so talented and kind. That event somehow inspired me to draw something. It is just that I cannot really share something like this, other than keeping it as my internal memory in my own cyber corner. This art was inspired by that office lady and this particular event. There was one time we were talking about McDonald's, and I was talking about my bad experiences working at McDonald's when I was a teen, including discrimination and a fight with someone, where I almost wanted to put a guy's face in not-so-hot oil so he could learn a lesson. But the store manager decided to be on my side, and he didn't ask me to pay back money when someone stole from my drawer, even though another manager wanted me to pay it back, plus all the verbal abuse. The store manager said he understood everything and said he had similar experiences. Then, during the summer cohort, I met another very inspiring fellow who was raised by a single mom, and they both worked at McDonald's. I enjoyed listening to her stories. That's when I also learned that the office lady was boycotting McDonald's at the time, and I admired people like her for doing microactivism, and for being very thoughtful and kind to everyone. Even though I am not very political on things that are not directly related to me, and I admit I am quite selfish, I asked her if Popeyes is as evil as McDonald's. I was very grateful that she said Popeyes is fine, and my heart was in tears, since Popeyes has very special symbolic meanings in my heart. I then impulsively apologized to that fellow who worked at McDonald's, and told them, from now on, I boycott McDonald's with you. To be honest, it was more of a personalized appreciation than any political sentiment. From that summer until right now, I have never gone to McDonald's ever again. Maybe because I am quite ritualistic and impulsive. During those times, I invented quite many new cuisines to substitute for restaurant food and saved a lot of money, though I later lost all of it on a research project loan. There is only one person I perhaps miss. That was the lady who worked in the coffee area at the McDonald's near Brooklyn College. She always said, "What you'll order, baby?" And I got your baby. And she was extremely friendly. I remember that sometimes there were arguments in other areas. And no matter how busy it was or what kind of noise there was, it seemed to not affect her. So I kind of had this imagery in my mind. Maybe someday this character will become part of our indie game NPC. Then it reminded me of that Yemeni coffee harvesting scene. Janbia is another top symbol, referencing many things. The actual Janbia, a data cohort where Command J became Telic Janbia, which also became part of the indie game inspiration. And those coffee harvesting images once made me cry, which I don't know why. I have an emotional disorder, I guess. Sometimes when people are sad, I feel like laughing for no reason, like in TV reality shows or movies, where occasionally sad scenes didn't really affect me. However, I once watched a Yemeni coffee harvesting show, and when everyone was laughing, I started to drop tears for no reason. Anyway, this picture inspired me in so many ways, though it was very inconvenient to talk about openly in front of people I know. Finally, that holding a Popeyes box in the back scene referenced something sneaky, as I didn't survive the summer cohort for 3 weeks, and the director removed my folder from the rest of the class. Though I don't blame him for doing that, I suddenly remembered that at the beginning of the class, that office lady sent an extra link about our folder. That link became my secret tunnel to lurk on my favorite fellow's research. I formally finished this Prelude on February 8th before 2 a.m., then worked on creating a quick video about this for my future reference. Yeah, I like to timestamp things, inspired by Stockhausen's Momenti. On December 15th, I had zero clue what was going to happen next. It was the deadline to apply for Columbia University, followed by Princeton, Harvard, and the CUNY Graduate Center. The reason I am still applying is because I want to gift myself something like trophies. Since during the initial interview I impulsively said I was going to apply to these schools, when the team asked me to look further, I actually appreciated the encouragement, though I expressed that I just want to blend into CUNY Graduate School. So there may be a chance for me to communicate with Professor Gerald. After learning that she is not affiliated with the CUNY Graduate Center, my old plan is half dead. During the summer, when that ethnomusicologist student instructor became very confrontational, and the director sent an email to the entire class saying he was piggybacking on what that instructor was saying, followed by disciplinary actions after he asked me, honey or vinegar, which I chose to put more salt on. Nonetheless, I still appreciated communicating with him, and thanked him for his kindness for accepting me in the first place. I took a U-turn and committed to a full-time final semester. I went through emotionally exhausting negotiations with the cohort director. We talked from 1 p.m. to nearly 6 p.m. Although I genuinely believe he is a kind person, the conversation was heavy. It began with my writings, moved into pedagogy, then into how composition faculties don't really care about your thoughts, touched briefly on white supremacism, and ended with suggestions that I consider an education major to think about thinking. We kept circling back to the ethnomusicology instructor issue. He framed it at times as an English issue, then spoke about how Arabs talk, how his Russian friend does things, and cultural mannerisms in general. I listened carefully, then set a clear boundary by saying, in the simplest terms, that an apple cannot become a pear, and when we are talking about fruit, it cannot suddenly be something else. I then grounded the discussion in history. Eventually, he asked whether I wanted to apologize to that instructor. I gave a crystal clear no, while still thanking him for his effort. He insisted that the comments in question were educational and meant for everyone. He had even previously invented a word to reinterpret what the instructor said, denying the phrase bark up the wrong tree. I asked him if he still remembered the word he made up. I had to clarify that I was not being hierarchical. He had emailed the entire class telling them to piggyback on what that instructor was getting at. He knows exactly what happened. The instructor herself sent me a confrontational reflection comment, and I simply defended myself when scientific racism was brought up. He continued to revisit the apology issue. I repeated that my response would be a thank you and a clear no. I also stated, in general, that I cannot be re-educated. He became slightly agitated, and I clarified that I was speaking broadly, not attacking his program. I even referenced his earlier comment about burning bridges and honey or vinegar's question, since that Glinda-style tone policing is so common. Speaking generally, I find it laughable that anyone, especially small organizations, would think they possess something valuable enough to bribe or silence me. This feels like the right moment to write a full summer reflection and reshape my life narrative. I already sent 2 apology drafts in good faith, genuinely wishing that the musicologist instructor completes her PhD, and that the other office lady could enter a PhD program if resources allow. Beyond that, I don't owe explanations for what I write in my personal spaces. I can write whatever I want. Reputation doesn't apply to me. However, before the year ended, I still sent that ethnomusicologist and the director an apology letter. Since I got what I wanted, I spent my final semester with my favorite professor, Gerald. I created intuitive music using declassified materials and sent them over to Hans Tuchku. It was a bit controversial, not like I was asking for acceptance. I may also send George E. Lewis a thank you letter soon. I just don't want to write another big text wall before hitting February 8th, 2 a.m. So let's take a small break and move on to my future works.
I almost forgot about the Magicless magic flute. Now it is nearly 10:50 p.m., February 8th, 2026, as I am editing the final part before making a quick animation of our text wall. Thanks to Professor Gerald's email asking about Magicless magic flute, I will make a quick final summary. That piece was inspired by Stockhausen's Momenti, fused with multiple notes at different moments of my life. I don't have time to explain them all at once tonight, since I want to finish this quickly so that I can focus on other homework. Tomorrow I have a DNA test because I had an extended review again, and due to lack of records and a series of family complications, I cannot prove that my mom is biologically related to me through paperwork. Though we have provided obvious evidence, this US passport didn't make me less stateless than my previous semi-stateless life. Meanwhile, we had a huge argument and nearly never wanted to talk again. Thankfully, I somehow used that music critic professor to shame her, and our relationship is less bad than before. Life is always like this. Everything happens so suddenly, whimsically, sometimes randomly. I remember having an argument with my mom while we watched The Last Emperor online, then Karate Kid and Cobra Kai, then Wednesday. She blamed me for being too political and said that caused all those issues in my later life. I actually don't regret anything. That's why I am now writing this as my future credential to crowdfund my indie game, music, and art. I am not afraid that my radical honesty will derail my career or potential connections. To be honest, I kind of appreciated that summer cohort director for being supportive, where he thought composition faculties were all white supremacists who don't care about anything, and he insisted I change my major to music education to think about thinking. I know that in the past I have written so many blogs and online expressions, and met very strange communities, which gave people an impression that I suffered from something. However, I don't feel the same sentiments that the director thought I may feel about. That's why I want to use this chance to clarify as many cases as possible, but I also don't need to erase my past nor invalidate my old memories. Yes, I have confronted a lot of people, but most of them were also very kind. Those disagreements were part of my learning journey, and I had never considered any of them white supremacists. At the same time, I also want to clarify that I don't deny the phenomenon of white supremacism and other minorities' experiences. To me, as I stated clearly, it is not about what I've been through. Everyone has been through me. If there was a problem, most of them were resolved in the end. The first person in the music department I confronted turned out to be very inspiring as well, though if we went back in time, we would argue again because I still don't agree with those modernism and atonal stuffs. Then there was a coordinator, an electronic music director. I once made very wild statements in my own cyber presence and talked it out in the nicest way possible, though it may have been offensive to some too. When I felt excluded, when that director kept mentioning attendance and such, I indicated here and there very openly that those theatre credentials meant nothing to me. Even if he paid me, I wouldn't go. Even if you brought Obama or Trump there, I wouldn't be impressed. However, my friend Chris saved me on this. Since he said that director was actually a very caring person, I cooled down a bit, thinking maybe it was all misunderstandings. I later sent him an email apologizing for not being able to attend the concert due to extreme conditions. In my final semester, I felt released that I could talk to him again in a friendly tone. I also thanked him from my heart for offering me the opportunity when Professor Cohen helped me facilitate it. That was the last time I ever visited St. Elizabeth and St. Stephen Church of Hungary, now both gone. St. Stephen was part of my daily routine during the time I lived in a homeless shelter. I only went to St. Elizabeth once due to needing to use the bathroom, so I waited until they finished the morning prayer, and the priest there was very nice. Maybe everything happened for a reason. As for that coordinator, initially I used strong words and a protesting tone. But ever since I saw him as the parallel of my data cohort teaching assistant Hussam, I could never hate him again. In fact, I made a lot of room lately, and so did he, and he let me borrow his computer during those hard times. I once thought that if Hussam had half of the resources he had, Hussam would get into Harvard. Then, as I am now putting up my portfolio, I realized that all those credentials meant nothing to me, as I just sent a very catchy portfolio to all those schools I don't even care about anymore. Anyway, my experiences with that coordinator later helped me better prepare for my final semester, so I could submit everything on time and leave room for other people who might be busy with many things. It also helped me be less paranoid about things sometimes. The final semester was a bit different. There was no place to submit portfolios, and everyone was busy. I wanted to email Professor Paulina but hesitated because in previous semesters I had some trouble with another professor, and somehow that professor felt like I reported something to Professor Paulina. Then I was volunteering with another professor as part of my plan B. However, after questioning about the PhD student she brought who used decompiled software that was not working at the time, not only did that professor discharge me in creative ways, she also kicked my teammate out, who wasn't even my collaborator. Fortunately, that teammate later graduated after retaking the course, so I no longer hold any grudges, but I still feel appreciative toward that professor as well. After emailing a few people a few times without responses, I decided to just be trustful, just in case Professor Paulina called the department or anything. That might give others the impression that I reported something to her. It was a weird psychology and academia dynamic I discovered. I believe I used my paranoia in a thoughtful way. I totally trusted that Professor Paulina wouldn't fail me even without hearing from me, since she had always been supportive. Professor Cohen was going to approve my portfolio when he was not busy, and the new coordinator was a very inspiring classmate whom I learned many things from during 1 year in the same classes. So the final semester was very peaceful, though I didn't get a chance to listen to what other people had composed. Meanwhile, I had been accepted by the Brooklyn College Master of Music last year. The acceptance letter said I could register for class, but registration for second or subsequent semesters would be based on having degree proof. However, I was not able to register, which delayed my degree for a year. For now, I decided to take another offer where I can register for classes first before getting my final degree approval. So maybe my palm reading was true, that this was my final semester at Brooklyn College. My paranoia back then was fulfilled. Back in 2024, I told Professor Gerald about my plan and mentioned Professor Paulina, and an unfinished piece integrating 3 themes, inspired by Rachmaninoff. Rachmaninoff's unapologetic wolf poetry in Little Red Riding Hood deeply inspired me. My friend Chris and Professor Paulina are both highly inspiring introverts, and that was the first time I came up with the idea. Fear of rejection made me hesitate, but Professor Gerald encouraged me to speak out. The following semester, I made a brave move to ask Professor Paulina for help, and she was very supportive. Thank God, because if I hadn't, I might never have had the chance to work with her during my final years. Professor Cohen was very supportive as well, and without all those special permissions, I would never have graduated. As for the professor I didn't get along with, it was a combination of misunderstandings, wrong interpretations, and academia politics. I wasn't mad at her, not even when she reported me to the Office of Accessibility, since the director was willing to listen first before making judgments. I was mad because she threatened to report me to an ex-director after the previous director wasn't on her side. She also thought I reported her to Professor Paulina. As for that ex-director, I only made a recommendation, wishing he would place Professor Gerald in some interesting classes so I could sneak in. I have an internal rule, including what the summer cohort director told me, that I need to reach out to different doctors for recommendation letters. I told him the only doctor I knew was Professor Cohen, and I trusted him. If he didn't recommend something, I would never go to someone higher than him. That's my unwritten rule. The only exception was that I took Professor Gerald's Music 103 twice without asking permission during the CUNY registration error period, when Professor Langsam was complaining about students taking a class 6 times. Another time was when I asked the ex-director to place Professor Gerald in some classes so I could register. So if he ever responded to the other professor faster than to our previous requests, we would have had very catchy conversations for sure. Other than the ex-director and her misunderstanding of my communications with Professor Paulina, I appreciated everything else that happened in that class, where I brought my most special pieces. That brings us back to Magicless Magic Flute.
I don't want to write a book-length story in this prelude yet, since I am writing a book now as a manifesto. It is now 12:17 a.m., February 9th, 2026. Another day is gone. I don't know when I will finish this and other homework. Then prepare for tomorrow's DNA test. Everything is unknown. The Magicless Magic Flute started with an album Professor Gerald shared, which I didn't like at the time, but she didn't mind. Then, in another music critic class when I presented Mozart's Magic Flute, something reminded me of this again, which I will write in later chapters, after the failed summer cohort, where I wanted to write about matriarchal influences in music. I transformed all those emotions into the prelude. As you may have realized, I never mention people's names when I had conflicts, not because I fear retaliation, since I am fully protected, but out of courtesy. There is only one exception so far, a data instructor I once had doubts with who now becomes someone I can hardly forget. Zach, my instructor, has a very interesting personality, which I will write about later. It was my own insecurity that made me worry I might not finish my homework. So I found a plan B that turned out to be a big joke. But throughout the process, I learned so many things. If I start talking about them now, I will have to look back at my LinkedIn notes. Anyway, Magicless Magic Flute is a highly intuitive composition integrating Stockhausen's momenti. In the beginning, there are non-traditional methods integrating music tradecraft I invented. It starts with Z, then Messiaen, then ends in Z. The first Z is Zach. The instructor I had trouble with liked Messiaen very much, so I put him there. The other Z is Zachary from NYC Open Data. It was a funny expression I once said during presentation night, that all people whose names start with Z are automatically good. Then Zachary from NYC Open Data, wearing a wrinkled shirt, happened to come to shake hands at our program. The music, of course, also embeds many other top secrets that are hard to explain. Then it is followed by Russian 5 styles, which I wish Professor Paulina could help me dismember those moments. It finishes in Auld Lang Syne. I will skip the details now to finish this entire prelude and start mixing animations at 12:27 a.m., February 9th, 2026. The purpose of this reflection is to clarify things so people don't get confused. I am in a program because I want to be influenced by other resilient communities, and that is more important than any rewards. Don't ever think I am in a program because I am mentally diverse, a minority, or because I write something about women. I am not afraid of expressing myself or being shamed for my methods. I had tons of conflicts with many people, but in the end, they all resolved in one way or another. I take full consequence in situations where people may not accept me when I am in my honest mode. And I am simply finding other programs or communities. I would rather people find their next parrots than virtue signal how universal or how tolerant they are. The Last Emperor movie somehow triggered me to write a different reflection. That Auld Lang Syne theme inspired me deeply this semester. That particular theme, Goodbye as We Say Hello, resonated deeply with me, and I wanted to speak honestly one last time before embracing my new life direction. With the help of Barn News Koshmar, Barn News Quaniac, and Barn News Marzani, we walk through life transparently controversial, conceptually unsettling, yet legally and ethically grounded. We build without apology. We experiment without fear. We publish without seeking permission from those who misunderstand us. We do not shame others for their chosen paths, aesthetics, or methods. We respect every worldview that respects ours. In return, we request equal clarity of boundary. Dialogue is welcome. Sabotage is ignored. Mockery dissolves in the presence of sustained work. We speak in many voices while acting in another, and our true purposes will always remain unfathomable to those who choose not to understand. Complexity is not deception. Multiplicity is not dishonesty. Strategy is not hostility. We are layered because thought is layered. If any algorithm wanders into our universe attempting to dismantle our candy recipes, we will simply smile and suggest what it might need to be lured for. This particular line is wrapped with the help of Barn News Quaniac. My original version was less diplomatic. Refinement is always preferable to destruction. We refine models. We refine systems. We refine ourselves. When in Rome, pray like Attila. Adaptation is wisdom. Context is power. We welcome genuine syncretic rebels, dissenters, and even those who disagree with us, as long as they are reconcilable and considerate. Disagreement is not hostility. Difference is not threat. What cannot coexist with us is not critique, but deliberate erosion. We are not here to dominate. We are here to endure. We are not here to erase others. We are here to create what only we can create. We are not here for noise. We are here for architecture. Transparency does not mean exposure. Controversy does not mean chaos. Disturbance does not mean destruction. We move deliberately. We document carefully. We build patiently. And while others debate appearances, we continue composing the structure. This prelude is not a warning. It is a declaration of continuity. I thought I would finish this journal sooner, but it turned out I mismanaged my time, and I couldn't finish all of it because there was simply too much to write about. So this first journal serves as our survival notes. Finished on May 26, 2026 at 2:36 a.m. Goodbye, as we say hello.